Folks, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me, and thanks for listening to myself and Stephen. And it's great to follow on from Stephen as well. I very much like to feel that I have contributed to any hair loss he might feel he has had over the last number of years, but we can talk about that another time. Before I go on into too much detail on the topic, I want to just present my angle, because I think it is important. I do coach, and I've played sport at a variety of levels, from participation up to elite sport. But fundamentally, I'm actually just about activity. I'm about kids being active. I'm about kids growing into movement, growing onto movement, growing into active adolescents who love moving, and then into active adults who love moving. I'm about coaching kids. And I do coach kids, but being honest, the sport that I'm coaching at any given time is completely secondary in terms of what I'm trying to achieve with the kids. And that does center around physical literacy. So I'm going to show you a very short video here, which hopefully will play and hopefully you can hear. This video for me fundamentally captures what we want to achieve. We want kids out playing, having fun, embracing whatever opportunities they have available to them. During lockdown, the opportunities tend to be like this. Fundamentally, these kids grow up into adults, and we want those adults equally to embrace the opportunities around them. And that's what physical literacy does. They can keep it to themselves, like myself here in the video. You have to hang yourself to dry, I think, in such things. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you through a quick overview of what I'm going to talk through today. So building on where Stephen has given a great foundation on what physical literacy is, why it's important, and so on, I'm going to talk a little bit about how much activity should kids be doing, why it's important, talk a little bit about some of our PE research on what that can tell us in relation to coaching, why the climate of our sessions is so important, and what all of this ultimately means for coaching. So many of you may be familiar with this, and some of you may not. Our children need to accumulate 60 minutes a day of physical activity at an intensity that we term moderate to vigorous intensity. And that's the minimum amount of physical activity they need to maintain their own health. So it's not just that they move, but that they move enough to get their hearts and their lungs working harder than normal. And this must include things like muscle strengthening, flexibility, and bone strengthening exercises a few times a week. But that intensity, that moderate to vigorous intensity, is the intensity level where the kids are slightly out of breath, they're slightly red in the face, they may be sweating slightly, but they've basically got their heart and lungs working hard enough to hit that threshold. And there are a variety of things that make up a child's physical activity. I have a number of them here on screen: playing, running, walking, skating, swimming. There's a lot of them here. And of course, one that we're very familiar with is the one of sport. And quite often, people will think of physical activity and sport as synonymous, but in fact, sport is one of the modes of capturing physical activity. And it's one of the most popular ways, for sure, for an awful lot of young people. And if we can hook young people to sport, if we can really get them to engage in a way that they have found their recipe for involvement and the thing that they're going to sustain for life, then sport can very well be the vehicle that actually keeps those kids active and healthy well into adulthood. So as coaches, why do we need to be concerned about physical activity for health in young people? And again, it can seem like they're two different agendas. You know, we're trying to coach a sport. We're trying to develop these children's aptitudes and abilities in that sport. Why do we need to talk about physical activity as such? Well, there's some research we've carried out on a particular program at DCU, which is YPath PE for me. And in fact, I think Wesley O'Brien may also be on the call. I saw him on the participant list earlier. So Wesley's a colleague in UCC who has been involved in this also right from the get-go. In fact, he did his PhD on this. And the research that we carried out, it showed us, yes, we have low physical activity levels. Okay, that's problematic, not just in Ireland, but across the world. Also, that consistent with what Stephen spoke about, we have low fundamental movement skill levels. And critically, the children that we're talking about here are adolescents, the 12 to 14-year-old age bracket. So the next group up from what Stephen presented on. When myself, Wesley, and some other colleagues at DCU carried out this particular work, we had one child out of 252, aged between 12 and 14, one child out of 252 had mastered the 9 fundamental movement skills we measured. So that's a huge problem. And it's building, as you say, you can see the picture from what Stephen has presented, but what we do know is that it remains consistent. We also know that the gender difference maintains across physical activity and across fundamental movement skills. And what we know is the children who are less active, they have low belief in their own ability to be active. Okay, that confidence, that self-confidence, the self-efficacy is low. And they have poor motivation to be active, and their attitudes towards activity aren't positive. We know females are significantly weaker. We also know across the board, when children are less active, they have poorer knowledge about why being active is important in the first place. So really it brings us around to the point that sport is about more than sport. Physical activity is critical for children, young people, and adults, in fact, for a range of reasons. So here on the left, you can see the range of benefits that can accrue from physical activity. And I suppose that the headliners usually, and they are the headliners for a reason, are that physical activity reduces the risk of coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. But fundamentally, when I'm talking to parents about this or teachers, it's this message here, that ultimately we can help our children to live happier and healthier for longer. And that as a core goal is something critical to all, whether it's children, adults, whoever it is, whatever age group we're talking about. And just to put this in context in terms of where we're at, I'm showing you data on screen here from Sport Ireland, and from a piece of work we did with Sport Ireland, which Declan would be very au fait with also. And while I'm showing you Irish data here, this is consistent across the world. So across the world, less than 20% of adolescents engage in physical activity every day. That's not even meeting the guidelines. So just engaging in activity every day. In Ireland, we know that at post-primary level, when we get to the adolescent level, only 1 child out of 10 is getting sufficient physical activity for their health and well-being. And consistent with the pattern we spoke about previously, girls are faring worse here than boys. Neither are doing terribly well, but girls are faring worse than boys. And when we look at the role of sport, okay, within school sport, you can see it has a huge role to potentially play here. That 70% of children at primary school say, yeah, well, I play sport in school once a week. When they get to 5th and 6th year, which is the upper end of post-primary, you can see how high it has dropped. That 38% are saying they never participate. 63% of children across post-primary saying they participate in school sport once a week. And when we look at that outside of the school, which is the community-based sport, again, you can see relatively high numbers. So what this tells us is we're not doing well overall. We're not meeting the guidelines, but there is scope. We have quite a bit of access that through sports clubs and coaches, kids are at large turning up. So how can we convert this into something that raises these numbers for health and well-being? And that's not an easy question to answer. Briefly, I want to explain to you what YPath is, and we won't go too far into it today. But ultimately, it's a school-based physical activity intervention. That's where it started. And it was developed based on cross-sectional research, which was Wesley's PhD, both qualitative and quantitative data. And the evidence that we gathered there pointed clearly to the need to focus on physical literacy in these kids. The components where kids were weak mapped perfectly to that physical literacy construct. And the target cohort in this work was 12 to 15-year-olds. And over an 8-year period between 2010 and 2018, we iteratively developed, refined, and evaluated YPath to something that we felt was working. And we carried out pretty robust research to evaluate that and prove that. And again, coming back to what Stephen presented earlier, why physical literacy? Well, ultimately, these were the aspects that we were seeing we were having problems with. Our children weren't active enough. They had poor motivation to be active. Their physical competence was not strong at all. And their confidence to be active was affected. And this spiral, as Stephen spoke about, had that negative effect that those that weren't active were getting less and less active because of this spiral of how these different things interplayed. So in our research with these adolescents, the physical literacy components, the key components we needed to focus on, and we did focus on, were 1, the children's attitudes, motivation, and enjoyment for physical activity, their confidence and beliefs in their abilities, their knowledge and awareness of the need to move, why we actually should move in the first place. And then those physical attributes, both their fitness and body composition, but most directly targeting this aspect, the fundamental movement abilities. And how we went about that, I'm going to show a combination kind of model here, which was pulling the socio-ecological model and the theory of self-determination together. And hopefully it doesn't look too complex. I'm going to explain it and don't get too lost in what's showing on screen. But I suppose it's the underpinning of how we structured White Path and how we feel it works. So you have the child at the center of this circle here, being influenced by the social environment around them, which is their peers, their parents, and everything else, the physical environment around that, and then policy. And that's always something that we can understand, that an individual, yes, they may have some element of free choice, but it can be quite limited based on where they're sitting within these different frameworks. And I think COVID and the pandemic and the lockdowns and so on have shown us starkly how much social environment, physical environment, and policy can restrict us when we're not allowed out, when we can't engage, when we can't go wherever we like, and so on. Within that, though, however, when we look at the individual, it's also really, really important to look at, well, how motivated are they? What is their level of self-determination? How self-determined are they to be physically active? Are they completely amotivated, or are they at a point where they're moving up this ladder here towards being intrinsically motivated to be active? That I am active because I like being active, I enjoy being active, it's something I want to do. Because that's ultimately where we want to get the kids to. If we can get them to this point where they're active because they love it, they engage with it, they really enjoy it, and they know it's so good for them, then they're more likely to be the active adults, and they're more likely to sustain those health benefits into adulthood. And within that, the three key aspects, and I'll talk about these again in a second, that we integrated across PE class, across the curriculum, were ensuring opportunities to develop autonomy for those children in the class, develop competence, and develop their relatedness, their feeling of belonging to that class and belonging within the class. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But before I do, very briefly, I'm not going to get lost in the research at all, but White Path is now across the country. It's available to all schools across the country through the Irish Heart Foundation, through a national dissemination programme. And we obviously, to get to that point, had to figure out, did it actually work and does it work? And we have carried out a range of different trials, from pilot trials to cluster randomized control trials. And the answer is, yeah, it's not easy. It does work. It's not easy. It's not straightforward. But yes, this type of approach does work. And to pin it down, what were the needs and what have we targeted in White Path? First of all, it's targeting the attitudes, the motivation and belief of these children in their own abilities to be active. And as Stephen spoke about earlier, that's critical. Me believing that I can do is critical. But it's also fundamentally important that I have the physical ability to match with that belief, that I don't just believe I'm good, but I actually do have those foundational skills that allow me to be active and allow me to engage. And that's where the fundamental movement skill element comes in. Ensuring in the PE class that there is a strong element of choice has been critical, and that there's a cooperative rather than an overly competitive element. And that can be different from sport to PE class, but that was very, very important for PE class. And then point 4 was helping to educate these young people on why physical activity is so important in the first place. And this brought us to our focus, having that clear focus for PE. What does it look like? And for us, fundamentally, it was enabling all young people to lead a sustained, physically active life now and into the future, and zoning in on that. And like my lovely dog, Larry, there's usually a tennis ball in front of him. That's what he does. Once he sees where he needs to be, he doesn't take his eye off it. And that's been a key component of White Path, is ensuring that that focus is consistent and clear, and that decisions that teachers make are towards that larger goal. And simply put, what makes it work is the teacher. And it's the teacher creating that right environment, the correct environment, the environment that allows the kids, applying the theory of self-determination, applying those ABCs, allowing the kids opportunity for autonomy, experiencing a sense of freedom and choice within the domain. Having that feeling of I can do, that confidence that I can do this. And also that they belong, that I relate to this, I feel part of the group, and I actually do matter and I can matter. So our target in physical education is in enabling all young people to lead these sustained, physically active lives. But that motivational climate within PE class is the linchpin to that. In the PE class, you're trying to enable them to sustain activity. And to do this, they need to be motivated to participate. And not because we're making them, but because they value activity for its own sake. And that's absolutely critical. And it is one of the biggest challenges facing PE teachers is how to create that environment so that all children feel that they actually can and will and do succeed. And the question I would have, pulling this back around, is this also the challenge facing many of us as coaches? Do we understand why our kids are attending the sessions? Are we clued into the motivations and the potential impact that their motivation might have on our retention of them in our session? So in a coaching climate, in a coaching session that has fostered a motivational climate, what we're looking at is an environment where all the children are learning that they can progress and they can succeed in their own way, that their input is valued, and that physical activity can be fun and enjoyable and a way of life for all. And as I said, for the PE teachers, that's not that easy to achieve. And the same goes for coaches. It's not that easy, but there is some really great research out there, and there's some really great tips and strategies evolving in the research. And as I draw this to a conclusion, I'm going to pull it back to one of the iCoach Kids seminars that was held a couple of months ago, I believe, around transformational leadership. So the work of Turnage and Cote, looking at, well, practicing what you preach, believing in your athletes, having a person-centered approach, involving athletes in the coaching process. All of this maps perfectly to exactly that framework that we use to underpin YPath. And it maps to that idea of having the motivational climate within your session. And Jennifer and John, they broke it down further to look at, well, what is transformational coaching? And when I read this and when I looked at this, I said, well, that's exactly it. It maps so well to what we know is working for us in PE class, modeling pro-social values, showing vulnerability and humility, discussing the goals, the expectations, expressing confidence in athletes' capabilities, implementing a collective vision, that idea of voice, providing meaningful and challenging tasks and roles. And that needs to be meaningful and challenging to the individual child. Eliciting the athlete input, again, having that student or that athlete voice within your coaching sessions, sharing that decision-making, emphasizing the learning process, and then showing interest in the athlete's feelings and perspectives, that belonging. You do belong here. I listen to you as much as you listen to me. So there's so much here that overlaps and that synergizes, I think, in terms of creating the climate we need to create. And I do think one question we need to come back to as coaches is, no more so than the PE class, but what is the clear focus for our coaching? And that's going to be different depending on who you're working with, I know, and depending on our own coaching philosophies. But we do need, I think, to be able to answer this question if we're going to be able to create the right environment for physical literacy and for physical activity for health.